There's no doubt the Nikon Z6III internal video options are a cut above earlier iterations that only shot 8-bit, and I'll explain what that means later. But I'll also argue, as I have before, that Nikon's 8-bit files are nice, as long as you nail exposure. The 24.5 megapixel Nikon Z6 full-frame mirrorless camera, the original, released in late 2018, or its successor, the Z6 II, released 18 months later, were and are excellent hybrid video cameras. Now we have the Z6 III with so much more, especially as it relates to video, which we'll look at shortly. The original Z6 won over the 45.7 megapixel Z7, at least in video specs, since it does not employ line skipping to reduce the sensor readout to the final resolution. This video will focus, if you will, on basic in-camera recording with the Z cameras. Let's get right to it with the basics of video recording. We'll examine more advanced options later on. To record movies, you use the Photo Movie Selector switch. Now, let's not forget, this was another excellent feature brought by Nikon that separates photo and video settings. Nonetheless, in the handy-dandy iMenu, you can share settings like set picture control, more on that later, white balance, active de-lighting, vibration reduction. If you wish, though I don't, you can set some of these to same as photo settings in the video recording menu. So whatever you set for photo is the same for video, and vice versa. The iMenu is as indispensable as it is for photos when it comes to quickly accessing video settings. And this will vary by camera, but default settings also include frame size, rate, microphone sensitivity, image area, FX or DX crop, metering, Wi-Fi connection, electronic vibration reduction, mechanical VR, AF area mode, and focus mode. Just as in photo mode, you can customize the iMenu for video in the Custom Setting Menu G, Movie, G1, Customize iMenu. Then you can choose the functions that you want quick access to. Here's my choices. For video, I want to make sure that I can quickly switch between focus peaking highlights and zebras highlight display, which unfortunately can't be used together. And that's with the Z6 or other Z cameras for that matter. The Z6 III brings a waveform from the Z9, Z8, and ZF, nice addition, which is accessed by a G video menu, brightness, information display, and you can choose small or large. Of course, the large will, however, take up a lot of screen real estate. Of course, AF area mode and focus mode combo are the often used functions that you'll want to become familiar with, more specifically for video, and just as important for still photos, and I'll examine that subject in greater depth later on. If you prefer, you can just turn the top mode dial on the camera to auto, press the movie record button, and you're off to the races. The camera will then adjust itself, mainly by using auto ISO, just like your phone camera does. But if you'd like to take your videos to the next level, stick around for the rest of the video. My question here, when it comes to basic video recording with the Z6 cameras alone, or any of the Z cameras really, can you produce quality video? While Nikon has made huge leaps in video specs since the first Z6, which was touted as video-centric, I'll make the case that the video produced by really any of these cameras is more than usable, even excellent. Hi, Ray here. I'm glad you could join me for a look at the in-camera video recording options with Nikon's Z series cameras. Though I won't refer specifically to all the cameras and all their functions, as hybrid cameras, meaning they shoot stills and video, they're really hard to beat. Anyway, I'll try to keep this as simple as possible, but we're going to have to examine some technical details of video to better understand why we might want to move from the basic auto recording example that I outlined in the intro. Internally, the first Z6 cameras recorded 8-bit 420 files, about which I'll explain more in a moment. The Z6 III now has a wide range of options from 8-bit to 10-bit, H.265 to RAW, Nikon's NRAW, and ProRes RAW. As I mentioned, the first Z6 featured direct sensor readout, with no line skipping or pixel binning. And I won't deliberate on that technology. Suffice to say that it generally produces a superior image, and at least at the time of release for that original Z6, it was very competitive. There are three main factors that affect image quality and the ability to manipulate the files when editing: bitrate, bit depth, and chroma subsampling. Bitrate refers to the amount of data that the camera records per second, and a higher bitrate equals, you guessed it, higher quality footage. It allows the camera to record more details about each frame. Bit depth refers to the number of colors that the camera can read per pixel. The Z6 offers 420 chroma subsampling, at least internally. So basically, that means that for the first row of 4 pixels, the camera will capture information from 2 of them. For the second row, it won't capture any. The next step up would be 422 chroma subsampling. In that case, the camera would capture color information from 2 pixels in each row of 4. 8-bit contains 256 million colors, 10-bit 1.07 billion colors respectively, and that's per pixel. If you wanted that extra color info from the first Z6, you had to buy an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja 5. Of course, more colors, more information, along with higher resolutions, equals bigger files. And this stands to reason bigger files equals more storage and potentially more processing demands. The Z6's maximum bitrate of 144 megabits per second was not exceptional. As we've seen, higher bit rates equal more color information. That doesn't necessarily show up in actual image quality out of the camera, but it does give more latitude for editing in post. For instance, if you need to rescue shadow detail, then you have more latitude because there's more recorded data. Makes sense, right? Atomos and Nikon collaborated to bring external 12-bit ProRes RAW to the original Z6. The Z cameras were, in fact, the first to bring RAW recording via HDMI. The flagship Z9 brought internal RAW recording, and that trickled down to the Z8 and now the Z6III. I also made a series of videos, which I'll link at the end of this video and in the description, on the rig or rigs that I've built around the original Z6, Ninja recorder, and other peripherals, audio recorder, etc., to record in higher quality codecs. Since then, I added rigs around the Z9, Z8, ZF, and now the Z6III. Audio is something else that falls outside the purview of this video. Suffice to say, internal specs have improved, with the latest cameras capable of 24-bit audio recording. Still, you don't want to rely on the camera's mic if you care about professional sounding audio, and you should. It's true that good audio is as important as the video image itself. Again, I'll refer you to my rig videos to illustrate what I use in terms of mics, etc. But a general rule is to not rely on the camera's mic gain. Turn that down and boost your volume via the mic. Many have a boost function, say plus 20 decibels, for that purpose. As far as specs, the original Z6's full-frame 24.5 megapixel CMOS sensor shoots up to UHD 4K at 30 frames per second. The Z6 II upped that to 60p, albeit with an 8-bit and DX crop mode only. I should mention that in my experience, the 1080p even on the Z6 is good enough to upscale in post to 4K without too much quality loss. Stands up really well. A full comparison would make this video even longer than I think it's going to be. So I'll add video specs in a sidebar. But the Z6III has really pushed those internal specs to another level, with the addition of 6K ProRes and H.265 5.4K up to 60p, as well as NRAW. Now, briefly, to Z System accessories, lenses in particular, because when it comes to the look of your video, Oh, these are going to be as important as anything else. The Z mount lenses are simply excellent, now totaling 46 with the introduction of the non-S-line 35 and 50mm f1.4 lenses. The FTZ adapter opens up a world of classic f-mount lenses for use with those cameras, not to mention adapters from companies like Megadap for other brands. I made one video comparing the Z 50mm 1.8S to a 70s classic E-series manual focus equivalent. And without getting into a discussion of disadvantages of focus-by-wire technology for video, I think most people, the F or Z lenses in concert with autofocus are excellent. First, depending on the lens, some of these have internal vibration reduction. And the Z cameras themselves have both physical stabilization and electronic VR. Now that stabilization is up to 8 stops with the ZF and Z6III, and access those in the iMenu. Most of the Z lenses, some more than others, are nearly free of focus breathing, where the angle of view changes visibly over a focus range. And I'll say here that the affordable 50mm f1.8, the first Z mount lens that I bought, along with my original Z6, really is a superb lens. You're looking through it. A full discussion of lenses, however, it's outside the purview of this video. But you can really experiment, as I say, with classic Nikons, other brands, and third-party lenses for the Z mount. With Nikon's RED acquisition, will there be a cinema lens line from Nikon? I think so. But I'll leave it there as far as the specific design and technical details of cine lenses. I won't discuss gimbals here either. I will say if you need more stabilization than a sturdy hand and internal and lens VR, what those provide, there's plenty of options for the lightweight Z6s from manufacturers like DJI and Zhiyun. But I will say this, if you want better stabilization, particularly when it comes to those micro jitters that defy removal by stabilization in post-production, add weight to your camera. Again, see my video rig tutorials for more on that. When it comes to editing, because I have that role as well, one that I'm much less qualified to assume, editing software, or NLE, non-linear editors, is beyond the scope of this video. Whether you choose Apple's iMovie or Final Cut Pro, Adobe's Premiere, or Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve, all these are excellent options, with iMovie being the free option loaded on every Mac computer. And that's where I started my filmmaking career. If you want to edit NRAW, Resolve is your only option at this point. Film, like today's sensors, has an exposure curve that represents the dynamic range of the recording medium. Ideally, we want to take full advantage of that curve, spreading our exposure out so that we don't crush it down, blocking up shadows, or so far to the right that we lose detail in the highlights. The Z6 has a maximum dynamic range at base ISO of around 12 to 14 stops. The Z6III, and this has been the subject of endless discussion, has somewhat less, maybe 12 stops. Since there's been something of a hubbub surrounding the video performance of the Z6III, first I'll talk about the dynamic range. There is a slight dynamic range penalty, which really seems to be a characteristic of all these fast-reading stacked sensors. And the Z6III's semi-stacked sensor is no exception. The only difference with this Nikon sensor is it seems that this small penalty is seen across the board. That is, using both the mechanical and electronic shutter. Compared to, say, let's talk about the Canon EOS R5 II, where DR with the mechanical is not as good as the original R5, but still better than the electronic. I mention that comparison not to confuse, but to illustrate that dynamic range penalty generally, that's to be seen with all fast readout sensors. I've commented in my 1-month review of the Z6 III, so I'll just say this. Ultimately, when it comes to filmmaking, dynamic range limitations never stood in the way of telling a good story. And the Z6 III is a great low-light camera. In addition, there's something else I feel requires comment. I'm referring specifically to the flickering debate. Flickering in the shadows, that is. My tests have revealed nothing that would ever be likely to interfere in my particular use case, as far as the settings that I regularly use to make videos. That means I can't see a time when I'd need to use extremely high ISO settings in daylight, or even low light for that matter. My ISO settings are likely to be at base ISO 100 up to say 800 ISO, which becomes the base ISO with RAW or log recording, and there's a quite usable second native ISO of 6400 with the Z6 III. And I can't think of a time when I needed to open up the shadows by, say, 5 stops. Okay, I'm not infallible, but I am usually careful to expose properly. Refer to my following comments on using the exposure tools. If I'm shooting in a very low light situation, it's unlikely I'll be shooting RAW or even 10-bit log. I'm more likely to shoot 10-bit SDR, which is really quite nice with this camera, or the Z8, Z9, or ZF. Even 8-bit, as we've seen. I'm not against pushing the limits on camera functions or photographic concepts, as I've said in other videos. But again, as is often the case with these push until failure experiments, situations where this problem would appear, it's really a fringe use case and something that can be avoided 99% of the time. And let's not forget lighting. It's an important part of video production. I don't have time to examine here. Can Nikon eliminate this flickering problem with a firmware update? Who knows? But I haven't encountered it in normal use. These issues seem to me to be the same kind of nothing burger that we see cooked up with every camera release from Nikon. When it comes to exposure, when we measure luminance with any meter, in camera or externally, it's important to understand that the midpoint of that scale is calibrated to 18% middle gray. The other measurement that you'll hear, particularly in regard to video, is IRE. Not to confuse, IRE, a scale created by the Institute of Radio Engineers, is, for all intents and purposes, it's simply another way of expressing light percentage from 0 to 100%. And 18% gray is 45 IRE in Rec 709 color space on a waveform. Again, that's not a tool that was supplied on the original Z6, but we have it on the Z9, Z8, ZF, and now the Z6 III. As if to confuse further, your Z6's luma values are denoted in the highlight display settings, G6, from 180 through 255. Measurements on the Z6 set 75 IRE at 180 out of 255 for 8-bit video. 100 IRE is at 235 and 255 is at 109. More on that later. Luma value, also known as exposure, equals percentage, not color, and I recommend using a gray card when possible. Of course, with video, nothing, least of all the light, stays still or the same for long, right? The most persuasive argument for external monitoring with these cameras is the fact that in-camera exposure tools are pretty limited. Pro exposure metering includes zebras, RGB parade, and false color. And we've seen the original Z6 only has zebras, aside from your usual histogram, which really, to my mind, isn't ideal for video. Usable, but not ideal. Zebras can be set according to what you're trying to accomplish. So to avoid a white object appearing too dark, underexposed, you want to set a zebra setting between 90% and 100% and adjust the exposure so that the zebra pattern appears on the white subject. Some report the Z6 III's ideal target is 95. I need to do more testing on that. To optimize for skin tones, set a zebra setting ranging from 45 to 75% and adjust the exposure so that the zebra pattern appears on the face of the subject. Again, this discussion, it's really the subject for a video in itself. Exposure has always been about how to get enough shadow detail without blowing out the highlights, how much dynamic range that you can squeeze out of the film, or now sensors, so that you have as much recorded data as possible to work with in post. Nothing's really changed there. If I was going to offer one general tip, it would be this. Don't underexpose if you want to avoid noise or flickering in the shadows when boosted in post. In the interest of condensing all the testing and research that I've done, it comes down to the common advice of maximizing exposure if you want to maximize both dynamic range and detail when shooting internal video on the Z6 or really any camera, no matter what codec you're shooting. That's much the same as saying ETTR, exposed to the right. Exposing for log is yet another complex discussion, but you do not want to underexpose, and I recommend a monitor with advanced exposure tools and the ability to load custom LUTs, so you have a better idea of how your exposure will ultimately look. At the end of the day, if you expose your footage carefully, then you'll end up with material that won't be too much of a pain to edit. Here I'll add another, I hope, condensed discussion of settings that interact with the exposure triangle in regards to exposure. Video throws in another variable, frame rate, and we are, for the sake of this video, using the manual setting, right? Because we've left the auto mode back in the intro. I'm going to assume that though we're talking basic video recording, that you want to understand the basics of video production and take advantage of the functions of the Z cameras. I won't entertain the question here of should you use 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, and depending on where you live in the world, we might be talking 25 frames per second. I mostly shoot at the traditional 24 frames per second. Traditional in that that's the frame rate that we inherited from film, and that's the look that we've become accustomed to in terms of the amount of blur introduced to or by moving objects. Obviously, that doesn't matter in a talking head video like this. And there's a popular argument about what looks best on a screen with 60 Hz refresh rate. But all monitors don't have a refresh rate of 60 Hz, and so on. Really, it's not a discussion that we have time for here. But whatever frame rate you decide on, the 180-degree rule, which you may or may not care to adhere to, says that you should choose a shutter speed twice your frame rate. So this video was exposed at 1/50th of a second. But wait, you say, that's not 2 times 24 frames per second. No, the Z6 doesn't provide an exact shutter speed of 1/48th of a second, nor do any of these other Z cameras. Some cameras, my GoPro for instance, do, but 1/50th is close enough. However, if you want exactitude, or near as damn it, the Z6III as well as the Z8 and Z9 allows you to fine-tune the shutter speed incrementally. That's really to control flicker from various light sources. But I can't see a reason, really, why it's not applicable in this use case. And you can find that control, it's called high frequency flicker reduction, in the video recording menu. Set that to on, shutter speed fine tuning, and then you can do just that. Closest is 48.3 if you want to go to that trouble. I like that it's possible on the recent Z cameras to lock the shutter speed or aperture, and that's great so you don't accidentally wander off the 180-degree shutter angle. I occasionally do that on my first Z6s and the ZF. If we're going to discuss exposure vis-a-vis the exposure triangle, frame rates, etc., then we need to talk about neutral density filters, or NDs. Because often, depending on existing light, you'll need to make use of them, especially if you follow the aforementioned 180-degree rule and you want control over your aperture to, say, separate subject from background. In my example, shooting at 24 frames per second and setting your shutter speed to 1/50th, and we're assuming that you're shooting in daylight, if you want to avoid using very small aperture, say f/16, which would result in greater depth of field, depending on the subject distance to the camera, you'll need to control the amount of light reaching the sensor by other means. And that's where ND filters come in. Now, they're available as single filters of various densities or as variable NDs. I originally had individual screw-in filters bought primarily for still photography. Then 100mm square filters, again, designed primarily for still photography. In the context of this video, I'd say if you want to keep it simple, use a variable. There are all kinds of options on the market, but I'll say this, as with all filters, it's important to invest in quality. Now, there's a common refrain when it comes to the protective filter debate. Why would you put cheap glass in front of your expensive lens? Indeed, why would you? Who does that? I don't. It's really a straw man in that debate. When it comes to protective filters, I buy quality filters. Same with any other kind of filters. So as I say, there's a dizzying array of filters out there. I can only talk with authority about those I've used. B+W, Nisi, and I have both 100mm square filters and holders. I'm very ND from Nisi, and I made a video about those. Generally speaking, individual filters are more color neutral and are less likely to introduce variations in the image, but of course, more expensive to assemble a decent range. Even though Nisi Vari splits 1.5 stops to 9 stops between two filters, those are around $250 a piece, and you can pay that for a single square filter. Other quality filters include Polar Pro, Tiffin, Freewell, and K&F Concept. Cinema filters are another option in sizes to fit matte boxes. 4 by 5.65 inches is the common standard, and the latter can run into a lot of dough, around $250 per filter. However, I've recently been trying out some filters from Kent Faith, also known as K&F Concept. They're made with the best optical glass from Asahi, I think it's called, glass company founded in 1907. And they can be had for $50 US. In my experience, they're as good as some filters costing 4 times that. With the correct neutral density, you have the option of opening up your lens as wide as your chosen ND allows. If you're not using ND filters, you're giving up creative choices as far as subject isolation, if that's what you're going for, since assuming, again, 180-degree shutter angle. Let's say you wanted to keep your aperture at 1.8 to get as much subject isolation as possible. That's what we've got here, to blur out that background. And without an ND, your f-stop is f8, and you need a 4-stop ND. An exception to the rule would be if we want a sharper video image without too much blur, especially if you're shooting fast action like sports. Then forget everything I said about shooting at 24 frames per second. Maybe you want to shoot at 60. Alternatively, we don't want to produce a jittery look by letting the camera choose a shutter speed that's too fast. Manual settings with intention, that's the way you make creative decisions. I hope some of that helps you make creative decisions. I've also been impressed with features like touch screen focus pulling to the degree that I made a tutorial video demonstrating its use, and it comes in very handy in some situations. For relatively stationary talking head videos, autofocus on these cameras rarely falters. The second generation Z6 II, that added eye recognition for video. The Z6III has all that and more with multiple subject detection modes and the power of the XSpeed 7 processor and this semi-stacked sensor. For this kind of video, I'm using full-time AF combined with auto area AF. That's the correct setting, I think, to use in this and many other video use cases. It works very well. Not that it doesn't do well in more dynamic situations as well. Now, as I say, we have specific subject detection. So here, of course, my camera's set to people. I'm a people most of the time. The Z6 II, that was criticized, as was the original Z6, for not including 10-bit internal recording. It was a fair criticism going on other cameras at the time. The Z9 and Z8 records 10-bit internally, as does the ZF. Internal RAW came with the Z9, then Z8, and Z6III joins that club. The next step in your video journey might be to explore the world of RAW and log recording and editing. That discussion, however, it's outside the scope of this video. That would require a more in-depth discussion, really, than we have time for. And this has turned into a much longer video than I originally planned. I did compare the Z6 8-bit internal recording with 10-bit recorded to the Atomos Ninja 5. That is, I made clips just with the camera using its 8-bit internal video combined with the flat profile, and then recorded 10-bit 422 analog to the Ninja 5. And I'll link that here. As far as media goes, we now have very fast CF Express cards with capacities as high as 4 terabytes, even large and relatively fast SDX V90 cards for recording video with cameras like the Z8, ZF, and Z6III. I've reviewed several options that I'll add to the description. The Z6 II added a second card slot, SD, and the Z6III follows suit. But none of these Z cameras, including the Z9 presently, allows redundant recording to the second card. And we can't record simply to an external drive like an SSD without something like an Atomos Ninja, which we can do with our phones these days via USB-C using something like NovaChip's super-fast Express portable SSD. Well, I hope this casts some light onto the basics of what can be a complicated subject. But really, the Nikon Z cameras make the job that much easier. As I hope I've made clear, the Z6, Z6 II, and in particular the new Z6III are superb little hybrid video cameras that produce professional results without a lot of extra peripherals and complex procedures. These cameras are used by many professional videographers, one of whom commented recently on my Z6 5th anniversary video that they just bought a Z6III for their main camera, but they still use 3 Z6s with external recorders for additional angles. I'll repeat that I think the flat profile is an excellent starting point. It leaves a bit of leeway for editing. Maybe you can add a little contrast and saturation to taste during editing. You can even experiment with LUTs. But be careful though. You may get hooked on the quest for cinematic video. And since Nikon has moved into the cinema camera space, this might be a good place to mention what might be a sign of things to come, with the release of 4 genuine RED LUTs for Nikon N-Log: achromic, film bias bleach bypass, and film bias offset. Love that last one. They're free to download from the Nikon website, so I'll put a link in the description. How exciting is that? So maybe this is a nudge towards another episode looking at more advanced video with the Z cameras. Let me know if you'd like to see me do that. Well, I hope this serves at least as a primer on video production with the Nikon Z System cameras. I did fit in as much as I could, and let me know in the comments if it helped. And please do let us know about your experience in Z videography. I will add some purchasing links for cameras, etc. that we've discussed here. I'll put them in the description. Some are affiliate links that earn me a modest commission at no extra cost to you. If you found this video useful, please do give it the old thumbs up. And if this is your first time here, please do consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell so that you don't miss new content. In the meantime, take care, cheers, we'll see you later.